Morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. I am Riza Lingwa, Communications Manager at the Foretia Foundation, welcoming you to this special webinar hosted by the CAFU Policy Institute of the Dennis and Lenora Foretia Foundation on the theme, Universal Basic Income and the Sustainable Development Goals, Prospects and Challenges. I have the distinct honor to introduce today's moderator, who is no other than Dr. Dennis Foretia, who is the co-chair of the Dennis and Lenora Foretia Foundation and executive chairman of the CAFU Policy Institute. Dr. Dennis will present to us today's guest and will be moderating the rest of the conversation. Dear participants, thank you again for joining us, and please remember to use the chat box to drop in your questions, contributions, and suggestions in the course of this webinar. For interpretation, kindly click on the interpretation button and select the language most preferred by you. Dr. Dennis, thank you for having us, and you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Riza, and thanks to the entire team for organizing this wonderful webinar, this discussion on a very important topic. I am Dennis Foretia. I'm the co-chair of the foundation. And today it's a distinct honor for me to have this conversation with Mr. Pooran Pandey on a very important topic on the issue of universal basic income. What are the prospects and challenges for universal basic income around the world? Now, the universal basic income around the world it's a concept that has gained momentum over the last couple of years, over the last decade, so to speak, especially after the passage of the Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations. The overarching issue being how to end poverty around the world, and the notion that individuals and peoples around the world need a basic minimum income in order to be able to live sustainable lives. So today we are going to be having an in-depth conversation on this issue, and I'm very delighted today to welcome Mr. Pooran Pandey, who is a non-resident fellow here in CAFU, well-researched and well-experienced gentleman who previously was a resident representative of Climate Scorecard, which was a US climate policy think tank mandated to work on capturing carbon footprint in over 25 countries. He also is a contributor for Springer Nature at the time in Germany, which was the first global encyclopedia of United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. He is the founding CEO of the Dialogue of Civilizations Research Institute in Berlin, which is a Berlin-based think tank, and he was the CEO from 2016 to 2018. And prior to that, he was also the executive director of the United Nations Global Compact, which was based in New Delhi, and the director of the Bennett Coleman and Company, India's largest media company, from 2007 to 2011. He has received various fellowships in recognitions for his contributions to national and international causes, and has had more than 100 publications on climate sustainability, circular economy, and the environmental issues. We are very, very delighted to have him join us today to talk about the issues of universal basic income. So Pooran, welcome.
It's a privilege to be with you, Dr. Foretia, and I'm looking forward to this very exciting conversation with you.
Well, thank you very much. And just so we start, can you, in a few minutes or so, give us what exactly is UBI, Universal Basic Income?
Definitionally, universal basic income is known to be a socio-political financial transfer program, which is given by the governments of the countries wherever it could be applicable, which is legally stipulated and equally set and given to the people regardless of any means test periodically. And it can be implemented at national level, it can be implemented at regional level, and it could also be implemented at local level. So definitionally, I would say that UBI is socio-political financial transfer program proposal, which gives certain, financial, uh, if I could probably, for the lack of any better word, say dole out to every citizen, regardless of any means test, which is legally stipulated and equally set and can be implemented at national level, provincial level, and the local level as well.
Well, I think that that is very interesting there, because you have really highlighted the issue of having, the means testing, right? Like you're saying that the means testing is not necessarily a component of this, should not be means tested. What has been the trajectory, the evolution, in having UBI being more in the public debate and over the last 2 decades, so to speak?
This has been very old age concept. It goes back to 46th century BC and was right at the doorstep of Julius Caesar.
Mhm.
And you could probably imagine the kind of evolution or the kind of idea that Julius Caesar might have had to sort of protect people in the community from not being able to have any job to do. And if there was such a crisis in any family, in any family in the community, then the king would go and give some money, some dole out, some goods and services, so that people do not really fall off the cliff and have some cushion to protect themselves against vulnerabilities or socioeconomic disruption. But then this concept began to gather momentum immediately after the World War I took place, which was 1914 to 1918. And the proponents were some of the leading economists. And these economists were very much concerned about how Europe in particular would like to battle the challenge and obstacle of a total annihilation of their economies. Because when the World War I took place, many economies in Europe were disrupted, they were bombed, their industrial activities stopped, people were killed, and women folks remained at the household to be able to do something beneficial and run the family, because most of the men in Europe had been killed in a way. So this whole backdrop of World War I in Europe comes to the fore, and then the economists began to sort of think through what will really happen to Europe. How will Europe try and revive the economy? How will the women folks? And this is where gender equality is not today's agenda. It goes far back in time and emanates in the aftermath of the catastrophe which emerged in the aftermath of the World War I. And this is where economists began to write about welfare, what will happen to Europe, how will they really build their economies, and how will people begin to build their lives, so to say. And this is where the first notion of welfare began to shape up. And this whole notion and idea of welfare began to shape up, not because of any political dispensation or the political parties, but it was led by the economists. And two people come to my immediate notice. One, Keynes was somebody who was trying to sort of think through this whole idea of how could economies be saved, how could people be supported. While the economies will be built, of course, they'll be built in near or short-term, long-term horizon, but people immediately needed some resources to be able to build or begin to build their lives around community and families and so on and so on forth. So two people took the lead. One was Keynes, another one was Bertrand Russell. And these two economists were British economists, and they began to really write about labor market. They began to write about welfare. They began to write about capitalist society that will eventually take over in UK and elsewhere. And then they began to talk about this kind of a notion of basic income, which governments will really need to provide to everyone in the community, in the society, both at the local level, regional level, and national level, so that there could be a fairly robust degree of cushion that could be built around vulnerabilities of the people, and also provide to them access to goods and services, and on the top, welfare. And with that money, people could probably choose to spend that money on where they would like to spend the money on. So they said in any open capitalist society, basic income will become one of the important welfare mechanisms. And this is how, starting after the World War I, these things began to sort of get the traction. But at the time we had the Second World War, this whole idea began to get front and center kind of an attention by the political dispensations which came and began to sort of look around in addition to building their economies.
Yeah. So as you say, I mean, Keynes and a lot of the just for simplistic purposes, big government proponent of a government with a big welfare system, really pushed this, post World War I, and obviously, post World War II, the UN system and the Bretton Woods systems, came into place. And for us in Cameroon, in Africa, a lot of our interactions and feelings about the Bretton Woods institutions really come through the prism of the structural adjustment policies of the 90s, and how it was always about, cutting away a lot of the social services, I say, belt tightening of the economy, and a lot of the social welfare or the services that are important or are needed for folks who are on the lower aspect of the earning spectrum, were cut, and that was that the safety net systems have not been strong. Now, if we fast forward to today, over the last, let's say, 2 decades, are there examples of countries where or who have taken the lead in ensuring that the concept of universal basic income is front and center in their political and economic policy? Are there examples that we can look at?
There are several countries around the world, both in the global south and also in the global north. And let me say, as we talked, about 2 things. One was the wars which happened, 14 to 18 and 39 to 45. And then you rightly sort of refer to what came out of World War II was the Bretton Woods system, including several multilateral systems which followed through later on. So it was basically a global north kind of a tool or instrument. The whole idea of welfare, if we were to really go back into the literature, comes from that part of the world. And global south has been, if I could say for the want of any better word, has been cut off from this whole safety net, if not welfare system, so to say. So global north took that lead. They created the system. And as you rightly refer to Bretton Woods, and when the Bretton Woods came, what really happened was that a fairly large part of financial resources were plowed back into the global north for two purposes. One, to use that part of that money to secure people, safety net, welfare system, and also by the way of introducing subsidy. And therefore, if you really look around, you'll find in the global north, many people who are richer end up getting higher quantum of subsidy compared to those who are poor. Not because the system is designed that way, but it was, meant in a way that, look, people who were sort of building those systems after the wars happened, they probably had more access to subsidy and resources and so on and so on forth. So it is basically a global north kind of an instrument, which later on got passed into the global south. Because global south has a very different kind of an ecosystem. Poverty, income inequality, and many other factors which go on to collide with each other. And when you really try and look at extreme poverty and income inequality and combine the two together and put on the top lack of resources in the global south, it really defies anybody's logic as to how many countries in the global south have been able to still take very, very arduous pathway to build some kind of a system which is still protecting people in ways that they can be protected. So while we talk to each other, the more than 75 countries in about last 2 decades who have been thinking about UBI, how to go about it, what can really happen if UBI as a concept or a notion was introduced, and then what will really mean if UBI as a concept or instrument or a mechanism were to be implemented on a universal basis. So a tool which got birth in the global north came to occupy the attention of the people in the global south because of those two things, income inequality and poverty. And if you really mix and match the two together, people become too vulnerable, they become too weak. And if something goes wrong in their lives for no fault of theirs, like the COVID-19 happened, many of those people could probably fall off the cliff and get back into poverty cycle. Yeah. So that is the kind of a backdrop in which UBI is now being looked at, and many economists have begun to look at this whole idea and the concept from how it could be really executed. It's a raw notion, very good idea. Those who have money can do it pretty well. But what about the global south, where we have variety of difficulties and obstacles? So how will this UBI as an instrument available in the hands of the government will get executed? That becomes a larger blueprint for many of the economists and also for those who are running the systems of the governments in the global south.
Yeah. Well, I think, this is a very interesting aspect of what you've raised with UBI being, an instrument really of social protection, being a good way of ensuring that, yes, people are able to live decent lives at, at a particular minimum income, livable wage, level. But at the same time, there is the aspect of social protection in it. And most of the systems in the global south, the countries in the global south, most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa do not have a good, strong social protective mechanism. And a lot of reasons for that, the power of even just their ability to collect taxes. It's funny because I think I read a factoid a few years ago that said that Africa is currently collecting taxes at a rate similar to what the United Kingdom was doing in 1880s. So we are not yet really good at at that collection part of it. Now I know there are lots of people in Cameroon who are going to argue that the government extracts a lot from them, which is not debatable really. But the mechanism to collect and then provide social services, especially to folks who need it, who need it the most. But I know here that UBI, there is no means testing really in UBI, but it's saying that everyone is supposed to have a minimum. Now, some economists may argue that when you provide such minimum in the economy, it tends to, for a lack of a better word, torpedo the economy. What is your response to those kinds of arguments being brought up?
I have very quick 3 points to make here. The first one is that the state is obligated. If we were to sift through literature or look at what Britain or institutions are doing, UN included, it is now a given fact that governments of the states are obligated through their duty of care principle to look after the welfare and help people and support them. This is the one. The second one is that as far back Keynesian's time, who has very clearly stated that in any open capitalist society, getting taxes from the richer and plowing that back to protect people who cannot afford certain basic goods and services to sort of protect themselves is morally justified and correct as well. The third part, where we are as of now, there have been 2 schools of thoughts. One, which has always been saying, and which is more on the left side of it, which says that, look, UBI is an antidote to poverty alleviation and doing away with income inequality. This is the left side of the story. The right side of the story is that these people, this school of thought, has been propounding for a very, very long time that even if we have the welfare states, we need to really improve the efficiency of the welfare state so that they can function better. So these are the 3 very important pegs that we need to really look. Like any other principle in economic sciences, it says that other things being equal, law of marginal utility will apply. So if I get a glass of water and I sip a very small portion of it, there could be a possibility where I could probably feel more thirsty, or I might have been sipping that portion of the water just to sort of wet my throat so that I could probably speak better. So we have to really look at UBI against these 3 things. 1, governments are obligated. 1. 2, in any open capitalist society, it is morally justified to take taxes from richer people and ploy that back into supporting people so that they do not really fall off the cliff. And the third one is that we really, whichever way we look at it, one is that welfare states need to improve on the delivery. They need to root out corruption, for example. They need to strengthen the bureaucratic systems and delivery mechanism. So this is the part which right side of the people take. The left side is that it could also be an antidote to poverty and income inequality. And just one example pretty quickly, Brazil, which is a middle income country or maybe lower middle income country, they started a program which was UBI program in a way. And they did not really give enough money to the people. they gave only $57 to their, people, and they could really cut down on the poverty by about 20% in about a decade time. Look at China, for example. They have gone ahead and said that using UBI, they have been able to take care of extreme poverty by December of 2020 at the height of COVID-19. India implemented, a scheme which was guaranteeing 180 days income to those who deserve. By using that, they could cut down on poverty fairly substantively. So there are these countries in the global south, China, India, Brazil, who by using UBI or UBI-like schemes have been really able to cut down on the poverty, and a very large part of that money which was plowed back into supporting people who are poor and vulnerable, that money came from the taxes which these governments collected. And therefore, that thing is sort of rested. That why should government not really collect the tax in order to see to it that the poor people, the people who are vulnerable, the people who do not really have enough means to sort of live their lives are supported within that parameter of governments being obligated to support people within duty of care principle. And therefore it has to be done in a way, and any system will really need to get some money from somewhere to be able to support the people who are at the bottom of the pyramid. So that debate of why not tax richer people and support those who are poor and cannot afford basic minimum facilities, goods and services and welfare schemes. So that debate is more or less settled. And how will the governments go about doing it would depend on local conditions, local ecosystem. So maybe the government in Cameroon will find one way to get the tax from richer people, and then how they will really like to plow that back to support the poor people, vis-a-vis what India will probably do. And that is why we were really to look at the corporate taxes now being capped at a fairly high level. That thing is also going to be taken care of, where people who earn, be they the people, be they the companies, be they anybody else, will have to really pay uniform taxes wherever they operate. Otherwise, many companies were trying to operate in different economies and countries and try to use that country where they had to pay less taxes, the tax haven.
Yes.
So reforms are also needed, both at the country level and also at the level which could be international in nature and character.
Yes. Well, I think thank you very much, Puran, for that very substantive response there. Now, you mentioned a little bit a few examples, the Brazilian example, China, India example. Now, can we, go a little bit into more of the practicalities, the practicalities of a policy like UBI. Now, the first thing that comes to mind, you talked of $57, which is about 35,000 francs in Cameroon or so. The first thing is, what is the level of support that UBI, the range of support that is considered for UBI in different countries? What is that range of support being directed? Now, I know there is no means testing per se for it, but if there is a policy for a safety net and plowing back into it, are there scenarios like the Indian example where the folks with extremely vulnerable are targeted? And the third thing I would ask is, in targeting, in reducing that poverty or so, which you've said as much as 20% in India, what are the the practicalities. How does that look like in real life? You know, is it going forward to have more earning potential for the folks who receive it? Is it building businesses? Is it being able to now send kids to school who were not able to go to school? So how does that look? I know it's a loaded question there. From examples, the practical aspect of how you go about it, the amount that is deployed, and how you follow that through.
Thank you. This is a very, very important question, and many economists have been busy doing the number crunching. And I have always felt, Dr. Fortier, that economists cannot provide solution to everything. And therefore, we need to really look through welfare, look through people and their circumstances and poverty and income inequality from social sciences perspective. And I learned it when I was graduating from LSC, and the whole focus was, how do you really first understand the problem, go to the root of the problem, and then try to figure out which solutions can you really come out, and then see how could those solutions be fitted into public policy instruments. And no public policy instrument ever comes, you know it better than anybody, in black and white. The states, and maybe something which is being done with a lot of very good intention of the local government or the national government, it may not work at all. Or maybe it might work a little bit, but then it needs to be retrofitted. It needs to be repurposed. And then taking some kind of feedback from the people who are using it, then you keep on improving, and then there comes a time when any public policy begins to walk or begins to operate pretty well on the ground. So going by the countries and how much of money they have been given, my judgment after reading quite a bit of literature on UBI is that countries which, again, are open capitalist countries have tendency to put on the table more money, which could then be plowed back to the people. So, for example, Luxembourg. Luxembourg is a place which is a tax haven. Many companies go and operate and give a lot of tax to Luxembourg, and therefore Luxembourg has a provision of roughly about $128,000 to provide for its people, compared to Brazil and India and China, who will range anywhere between 45 to 52, 53 kind of a dollar. So propensity of the governments in countries will depend on where they are, what is the kind of a level of taxes that they can mop, and then how do they really use the instrument of deficit financing. So these three things come into the picture. One, the local condition, the kind of taxes which these governments can mop up. And then some governments will also try and use the instrument of deficit financing to be able to put more money on the table by the way of giving subsidy on a poor person's ability to send his daughter to the school, for example, or giving health insurance to the people, poor people who cannot afford in case they fall sick. So if you really look at these three things, that will probably go on to determine the kind of resources which could be brought forward, put on the table, and depending on how much of money governments have, and what kind of a money they will really like to give to the people who are poor and vulnerable, versus those in the global south who might also like to resort to a scenario which could probably mean deficit financing, so that they will really like to support people, make them more employable, give them more skills, and see to it that they are prepared enough or fit enough to go and begin to work in the labor market. And when they begin to work in the labor market, they will bring the money, they will spend that money on, buying and purchasing and sending their sons and daughters to the schools. So economy also begins to benefit, and that sort of creates a multiplier impact on regional and national economy, giving a lot of impetus to the growth, economic activities, which is reflected back over a period of time in terms of better well-being of the people on the one hand. And since these people have better well-being, they are going out and earning money, coming back and spending it in the local economy. They also end up supporting the growth and economic activity at the national level as well. So it makes pretty good sense for many countries who have been doing it by the way of putting this tool and instrument of deficit financing, creating more money and putting that money to deploy for welfare and well-being of the people. And COVID-19 and climate crises, these things are beginning to prove that point, which some of the governments in the global south tried to implement a couple of years back, didn't succeed because of politics, but now everybody is coming together and saying, we will really like to sit together even with the opposition parties, a non-partisan element to UBI is being looked at. India, for example, has been looking at it. Countries in global north, US, for example, Alaska was the first place in the US to implement UBI. And as we talk to each other, they continue to do it. Of course, they're doing it by putting, a lot of hedging on oil bond, which is again becoming some kind of a discussion point. But how will any government of the day will like to earn the money from oil dividend, which is also which goes against the very effort that the US is putting to fight the climate change, but they continue to earn money on oil dividends, and whatever they get, keep on plowing back to the people, the families, communities to keep them intact and secure their welfare.
Yeah. Well, so thank you very much. Now to our audience, I see there are questions already coming up, so this is very good. Now, if you would prefer, or if you like to pose a question directly to Mr. Pandey, to come on to indicate that to our communications team, if you're open, by just indicating in the chat, and our Riza would assist in having you pose your question directly to Mr. Pandey. But I see that there are some questions that have already started coming in. I will take one from Arun Keshar. Arun says, in developing countries like India, do you think that the state governments will have enough resources to implement anything like UBI without going through means testing and identifying who is poor and who is not?
Very good question, and I'm very happy that this is coming from one of our colleagues in Cameroon. As I said, that many state or provincial governments in India also go back to deficit financing method. Because one, it makes sense to support people who are poor, who are vulnerable, who do not have enough income. And many of these provinces in India and the people in those provinces, by and large, depend on agricultural income. So every state government will like to create some welfare scheme and put some non-agricultural income in the hands of people. Because agriculture is dependent on rain. It is dependent on several natural factors and agencies, and therefore they usually resort to deficit financing method, which I talked about a little while earlier. The second part is that many state governments in India have also been trying to go back to the drawing table, a drawing board, and trying to see to it that what are the kind of welfare schemes which they already have.
Mm-hmm.
And then many of those welfare schemes which were put in place a decade back or 2 decades back do not really live the utility. So they're also trying to sort of bunch it together.
Mm-hmm.
So when they bunch many schemes, some of them useful, some of them not very useful any longer, then they begin to cover a fairly large number of poor people with regard to what the governments of the state level in India might end up doing. And thirdly, two other things accrue out of it. One, that when the state governments try and support poor people, or those who are vulnerable, or those who are at the bottom of the pyramid, they try to build trust of these people in public leadership, which means that the people who get these support or support system from the government of the state level in India, they tend to sort of put high faith or high trust or high credibility on those state governments who are successfully trying to find resources and passing those resources on to the people who are poor and vulnerable. So that is the kind of additional benefit which comes. And then these state governments also try to improve on their delivery mechanism. They try to cut on corruption. They try and create decentralized kind of a system whereby people could go and wherever they are, they could probably go and get free, dole out, which could be both money, which could be financial transfer. It could also mean wheat, rice, oil. And this is what really happened when COVID was the peak. And in India, some 80 million people have been given these kind of a mixed kind of a welfare dole out so that they could keep the lives together. When COVID was the peak, they could not go out, and they were too poor to have spent all the money, whatever they had. So in India, this is the kind of a broad framework which the governments of the state level are trying to do, which is bunching together many welfare schemes into one, deficit financing being resorted to, and thirdly, they also sort of try and see to it as to how could they really do more with the less, which means putting systems together, trying to cut on seepage, which probably take a fairly large quantum of welfare scheme out into the pockets of the bureaucrats. So by doing these three things together, many of the state governments in India are trying to walk that kind of a difficult pathway, but they have been trying to do it successfully, which is also resulting back into some kind of political dividend, if I could probably say.
Yeah. Well, I think thank you for that, and I think this is a very important point raised regarding the experiences of different countries in response to the COVID pandemic, the shock that the pandemic unleashed around the country, and how folks were really extremely vulnerable, were made way more vulnerable, and a lot more folks, estimate of more than 40 million more folks, actually 400 million more folks getting into extreme poverty as a result of the pandemic. Now, I have another question. This question, it comes from Lottie. I am Lottie from Cameroon. I would like to know if UBI policy provides sustainable income to recipient. In other words, are recipients becoming more dependent on social assistance, which is always a worry that folks have regarding social welfare systems, social protective systems. So in the sense that it doesn't become a thing where folks decide that it's better to remain in this system than to be out in productive work?
It is again a very, very good question. And let me very quickly give two examples to it. The first thing is that everyone, all of us, not in general circumstances, but maybe there could be circumstances when we could all need some kind of an instrument to help and support some of the best people. I mean, what really happened when financial crisis of 2008 happened? Many educated people, some of the people from Ivy Leagues, they lost a job. The same happened when the COVID-19 happened. So we really need to really provision for an instrument which could be deployed when institutional systems which are designed to help and support people fail. So UBI has to be looked at from that particular point of view, and not really something which is one thought given to people for a very long time, regardless of who they are. So we really need to remember the following, that UBI ideally should not be treated as a substitute to employment. If I lose my job and if I get UBI, my effort has to be that in a given time frame, if I lack in a skill, can I sort of improve my skills, and then within a time frame, using my skill set or improved skills, I go back and become the part of the labor market and begin to sort of earn the money and run my home, my family, and contribute to the economic activity. So it should not be treated as a substitute to any employment. It should also not be treated as a long-term economic goal. So if we were to really keep these two things aside, we could create equity. We could really see to it that we have a conveyor belt where people are brought in when they need it. But the moment they are back into the labor market, they're taken off, and then more vulnerable people are put on that conveyor belt. Let me give two examples to sort of justify the point which I'm trying to make. There was one pilot which was done in 2018 in Finland, which is one of a fairly developed economies in the global north, and social democrat kind of a system. So they believe in taking care of people, but also seeing to it that everything is equally distributed. And even they, despite having a lot of money, they only picked up 2,000 unemployed youth from random, randomly from the community, and gave them 560 euro to support their living. And because in those places, people, by the virtue of being 18 years, they are out, they are on their own, they are independent, and therefore they were picked up randomly and given 560 euro. And then the condition was twofold, that even if they get employment, they will not lose this benefit of 560 euro. And if they get into the employment and they still run short of the money which is in excess of the basic income which is being given by the government, they will continue to get it as well. But then what happened was two things were found. One, that these 2,000 young people who were unemployed, did not have enough resources, they were living out away from the family. They began to sort of feel better in terms of their well-being, social well-being, and their mental, health as well. So it was then stated by the Finnish government that UBI is not a long-term employment benefit being given to these people. It is also not an economic dole-out being given, but there is something beyond economic dole-out and employment, which means you and I in our communities feeling taken care of? Are we really feeling having our own well-being? Do we really feel mentally stable? And this is what really happened slightly before COVID-19 struck. So it happened in 2018, and Finland's government has agreed to continue that plan going forward, but by being able to identify the people who need them, but they will not really be given that for a very long time.
Yes.
And that kind of a rollout will not be treated as a substitute to employment at all.
Yes.
So if those things are taken into account, governments can probably better leverage the resources, whatever they have, especially for the global south, where we do not really have enough resources to, sort of squander or waste or give it to everybody all the time. But can that be done in a way whereby we create equity in terms of helping people and supporting them by guiding them to get into the labor market? And then after they vacate that space, then their counterparts or the peers or the colleagues and friends are put back on the conveyor belt, and then they're taken care of. So this is an incremental way of helping and supporting the poor, the vulnerable, those who do not have enough income to spend on basic minimum necessities of life. And my reading of UBI is that it falls somewhere between subsistence level and minimum wages. But it is neither subsistence because there is a definition to both. But UBI fits pretty well somewhere in between, and therefore it cannot be anything but an interim measure undertaken by the governments to be able to support the people who somehow have fallen off the cliff and do not really have any cushion to guard themselves against vulnerabilities of socio-economic and political nature.
Well, I think, as we wrap up, there is another key point that you've raised in the fact that the policy of a UBI, it may have a nomenclature issue where it's an income, but it's an income that is on a temporary basis, so that has to be it's one of the things where as you start looking at it from a policy communication standpoint, that it's a short-term ways of really supporting folks to give them a shot. And yes, there are others who will say, okay, that's a welfare system, and yes, it's a component of a welfare of the spectrum of welfare services that could be deployed. Now, as we wrap up, Puran, can we think of some of the what are your thoughts on real policy recommendations to countries like Cameroon, Nigeria, South Africa, some of the countries within our space, that are considering this, the social protective services and the resources available is quite limited. It's similar to what was highlighted earlier regarding the availability of resources in certain Indian states. So how do we start looking at it from a policy standpoint regarding policy uptake in governments? How do we pitch that to governments in our neighborhood? And then I'll have one question from Mr. Konga once you're done with those ideas.
Thank you very much. This is, in fact, a very, very important policy debate, which is sort of happening in more than 70 countries as they speak to each other, centered around UBI, what it is, what it can be, what is the future of UBI, and how could welfare schemes and social policies be repurposed? How could it be retrofitted? So policy regime cannot really reinvent anything which is not available. As I said, in case of Indian states, they're trying to do a lot of creative things whereby they are being able to, do more with less. As you rightly said, that is a kind of a limitation which most of the countries in the global south have. I have the following 5 things, which is easy, not difficult, but then will really involve the political will of the government of the day. So first thing first, many countries around the world, as we are talking to each other, are looking at seeing to it as to how governments and private sector work more closely with each other. Because until now, private sector has been sitting away from the whole debate on UBI. And they need to become a part of this debate on UBI, because as technology improves, robots come, many people are going to really lose their jobs, and companies cannot really sit away and look at the governments and want governments to do everything, and they keep on sitting aside and aloof. So first thing, private sector and the governments need to begin to talk to each other. It will really help everybody. It will help the private sector because they will get better people, more trained people, people with better skill sets. And when the people are better trained, they earn better money. And when they earn the better money, they pay more taxes to the government. So it could probably work in a fairly win-win way, and therefore the two sides need to talk to each other. Second one, diaspora. Countries like ours, India, for example, we have 5th largest diaspora around the world. And the kind of money this diaspora sends back to India is roughly about, this year in 2022, it is roughly about 80 billion US dollars, ahead of China, ahead of everybody else. So we need to really look at diaspora, which has gone away, but it still has a lot of willingness to help and support and support the motherland, so to speak. Okay. Third one is through development cooperation mechanism. As I said, and we did talk about it, governments have limited resources in India, in Cameroon, and Brazil, and China. How do we really find more creative ways to be able to generate more resources? Development cooperation looks to be the third kind of a policy instrument, which could put roughly about $125 billion worldwide if this tool or instrument is correctly leveraged. So this is the third one, development cooperation. And within development cooperation, South-South and triangular both. So depending on where we are, Cameroon, India, and why not India, Cameroon, and France. So both South-South and triangular. Third one. Fourth one, governments could always try and go back to a short to medium-term recourse on deficit finance. Because if they do not really develop their own people, unless they educate their boys and girls, unless they take care of their health, unless they secure them against a scenario like COVID-19 tomorrow or the day after, we will not really be able to build our economy, because people are the real fulcrum. If trained, if supported, will go back to the labor market, earn more money, and that would be a win-win. Finally, we really need to see to it that we really also try and mobilize instruments which are available at Bretton Woods, IMF, World Bank, WTO, UN. And it was very interesting to note that when COVID-19 was the peak, Secretary General of the UN issued an advisory to every country around the world, asking them to plow back the kind of saving which many countries are making on account of spending less oil and fossil fuel onto UBI kind of scheme to support the people who have fallen off at the cliff of the welfare. And what really happened during the COVID-19, it was a UN figure which I'm going to quote, roughly about 130 million people have fallen back into the poverty cycle. So if that be the case, and if we have really, if the governments have to take some hard steps to sort of bring these people out of the poverty cycle, I think UBI could be a win-win instrument. And these 5 things that I stated, if they could be really taken up either in isolation or in combination of 2 or 3, or all of them put together, I think UBI could be a very good instrument, not treating it as an employment kind of a thing, nor is it a long-term economy rollout, but then an instrument which will help secure people falling on the welfare cliff and then plunging that society or community in a chaos or crisis. So when we really look at chaos and crisis of the people versus some more money being spent by the government, leveraging those 5 instruments, I think it will be worth a while for the governments to think in terms of leveraging a UBI as a short-term kind of an instrument to safeguard people and alleviate poverty and do away with income inequality as well, which has been the curse of humanity, both in Asia and Africa, which has more than 3/4 of humanity living on Asia and Africa's surface. So we cannot really ignore that at all. Governments cannot ignore, private sector cannot ignore. Instruments of development cooperation and Bretton Woods instruments can no longer afford to ignore it because the welfare and well-being of the people finally will be at the center of how our economies are really going to grow, develop, and thrive as we move into some of these very complex and uncertain and unpredictable situations of tomorrow, so to say.
Well, thank you very much, Puran, for this. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I think that this has been a very, very illuminating conversation, which is just getting started. And we look forward to continuing the discussion and also engaging more with our policymakers around to get this aspect of social protection becoming anchored in the policy debates as well as policy proposals that come from. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having joined us. Thanks to Riza and the entire communication team that has made this possible. Tala, Epo, Stefan, Glenn, and everyone who has made this possible. With that, I am going to move to close and wish you all a very good time, good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Forti. It was a treat to be with you and to talk to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.